units that are exposed to the west of this rift near this Lake Yasi. And then surrounding the Ngorongoro volcanic area are plio-Pleistocene volcanic units. At the tops, and to the west, there are some volcaniclastic, smoothly altered tuffs. And then at the summits of these volcanoes are more recent soil deposits, which are these yellow units, and bright yellow here and light yellow here. And then also there's some recent alluvium at the slopes of the base of the volcanoes adjacent to this lake. So there's a very clear spatial distribution in rainfall in the region. And so here's a three-dimensional kind of view of the highland area. And you can, just by looking at this, you can notice some pretty obvious things where the highlands look really green and the surrounding lowlands are pretty dry looking. And so the idea is that moisture that comes from the Indian Ocean is intercepted by this massif where it condenses and precipitates out and results in very, like a dramatic rain shadow in the region there. So that's sort of the spatial pattern, but in terms of estimating recharge, how much water actually gets into the aquifer, it's important to get more quantitative information of how much rain is actually falling. And while this relationship is known, no one's actually studied there are no recharge studies for the region. So in terms of temporal patterns, they're due to the twice-a-year migration of the intertropical convergence zone. There are two wet seasons that occur a year. One is the long rains from March to May, and the other is the short rains from October to November. And then the literature also suggests that the El Nino Southern Oscillation in the Indian Ocean dipole are also play a factor in terms of the inter-annual variability in rainfall. Here is an image that shows the surface drainage for the region. So I just basically looked at where ephemeral streams move based on the geomorphology, and what you can see is that's what these blue lines represent. So in general, rainfall falls in the highlands and moves to the nearest base level. And in the case of this region, that is the Lake Yasi Rift Lake right here, Lake Minyara, which is to the east, and then Lake Natron, which isn't pictured but is to the northeast. And then there are also some smaller lakes, Lake Mesek, Lake Ndutu, Lake Olalbal that's not pictured, and there are some little lakes in the craters as well that hold water. And then when it comes to groundwater, really not much is known other than where the springs discharge and into the lakes in the springs, where the water discharges into the lakes and springs. Okay, so it should be noticed, as Gail mentioned, so a lot of the field methods, this was a reconnaissance-based study where we visited the springs this past summer, but these springs have been visited as a part of Dr. Ashley's more ongoing research many times in the past several years. So we visited all of these 9 springs, and we took field descriptions, photographs. We also sampled the water. And then in terms of the lab methods, what we did was we did a geochemical analysis of the spring water samples. We sent it to a lab, but where we got them analyzed for major ions in the water, as well as the hydrogen and oxygen isotopes. We also analyzed precipitation data and made geologic cross-sections and spring schematic conceptual models. Okay, so on to the results. So we obtained rainfall data. All of these red diamonds represent rainfall data that were received from the Ngorongoro Conservation Area. There are 23 rain gauges that they monitor. And getting this data really was pulling teeth, and it was done by Gail throughout the years. And then we also obtained data from this one gauge at Kasima Ingeda that was collected by a local resident, a colleague of Gail, Krishmelli. And so for the purpose of this analysis that I will show you, I'm just going to focus on data, the rainfall from the Ngorongoro headquarters, which is located in this highland area at about 3,000 or 2,000 meters. And then the Kasima Ingeda location, which is in the lowlands next to this lake at about 1,000 meters. So here is a hydrograph showing the yearly precipitation for about 20 years at both the NCA location in purple, which is the highland location, and the Kasima Ingeda location, which is orange, which is the lowland location. And just from looking at this, you can see there's a pretty clear spatial pattern where the highlands get more rain than the lowlands. And in fact, the NCA during this time range received 936 millimeters on average, while the Kasima Ingeda received only 469. So the other pattern you can see when you look at this hydrograph is you can see there's this cyclicity over time, this temporal pattern. And so because the literature suggests that El Nino events in particular bring wetter conditions to East Africa, I overlapped the El Nino events here. And so there was an El Nino event in 1997, which correlates pretty well with this peak in rainfall. Same for in 2003, 2002, 2003. But in 2007, there's a huge peak in rainfall, and this is actually during a La Nina, which is known to bring drier conditions to East Africa. So then I also saw the literature suggest that the Indian Ocean dipole also plays a factor in bringing moisture to the study region. And so positive IOD events are known to bring these wet conditions. So I overlapped those positive events into these green bars. The 1997 one corresponds with the El Nino. And then in this 2006 year, when there is a peak of rainfall, perhaps the Indian Ocean dipole plays an effect there, but really not sure about the other ones. So from looking at this, it kind of seems that El Nino and the IOD alone aren't really the best predictors for this interannual cyclicity. So then I'm just going to zoom in on 2010 and to 2013 to see the seasonal patterns, temporal patterns in rainfall. And so as the literature suggests, this region receives 2 wet seasons a year. One is from March to May, MAM, and one is from October to November, ON. So at both sites, Kasima and Gaeta and the headquarters, you can see this twice-a-year rainfall event. And so MAM typically, although it varies from year to year, the MAM wet season typically receives, or at NCA, it received 456 millimeters a year on average, while the ON only received 52. So here are the results from the stable isotope analysis. So plotted down here are the delta oxygen 18 compositions, and then up on this y-axis is the delta deuterium compositions. So most of the springs, and so we did the analysis for springs as well as for one lake. And so most of the springs fall above the global meteoric waterline, which indicates that the local atmosphere for these springs was more arid than the global atmosphere. And so the lake does not fall on the global, it falls off the local meteoric waterline because there's a lot of evaporation there as it's a lake. And then these 2 springs, however, also fall off the local meteoric waterline. So there's something going on there. So I made this conceptual diagram to sort of conceptualize the isotopic fractionation going on in this area. And so here it's kind of a cross-section from the study region to the Indian Ocean in the east. And so as water is precipitated from the Indian Ocean and travels landward, the delta 18, oxygen 18 composition becomes more negative. And this is associated with, as it migrates landward, the atmosphere migrates landward, the heavier isotope oxygen 18 preferentially precipitates out, making the delta composition more negative. And so that is typical of the region, more negative than at the global. But particularly for this region, it was even more negative than it is expected, and that's attributed to these nearby rift lakes in which they recycle water into the local atmosphere, and the preferential evaporation of the lighter isotope is what contributes to that being more negative than expected. And so for the geologic cross sections, I made these for most all of the springs, but